In the quiet of the night, when the world outside begins to fade into stillness, it can be strangely comforting to drift back in time, to an age when the world was filled with mystery, superstition, and the curious daily lives of people who walked before us. Tonight, we're going to explore the strange jobs people once had in the Middle Ages, unusual occupations that seem almost unbelievable now, yet were once considered ordinary, even essential. From those who made their living collecting rats, to others who carried out sacred rituals or handled tasks too dangerous or unpleasant for most, their stories reveal a side of history that is often hidden away. Before we begin, I'd like to invite you to join this journey beyond just tonight's story. If you enjoy discovering history in a way that helps you relax and unwind, please take a moment to subscribe to the channel. It helps us bring more of these stories to life. And I'd love to hear from you, too. Let me know in the comments what kinds of history you're most curious about, or simply share when you like to listen. Some of you may put this on before bed, while others might listen during quiet moments of the day. Hearing your experiences helps us shape these stories for you. So settle in, get comfortable, and let your mind drift. Imagine candlelight flickering against the stone walls of a medieval town, the sounds of distant footsteps on cobblestone streets, the muffled hum of a marketplace closing for the night. Somewhere in those shadows, ordinary people were performing extraordinary jobs, work that feels alien to us today, but once kept society running. Over the next chapters, we'll wander through their lives, slowly and calmly, pausing to appreciate the odd details, the strangeness, and the humanity of it all. Stay with me as we begin our journey into the strange and forgotten jobs of the Middle Ages. And remember, when we come to the end, I'll remind you again. But for now, if you haven't already, please subscribe and share your thoughts and listening habits in the comments below. Now, let's step quietly into the first chapter and meet the rat catchers. Picture yourself walking through a narrow medieval street. The cobblestones are damp, the air heavy with the scent of smoke, animals, and refuse. The homes are close together, their upper stories leaning inward, nearly touching above you, blocking out much of the sun. In the shadows below, something scurries. A small gray blur darts across your path and disappears into a crack between stones. Then another follows. In the Middle Ages, this was no rare sight. Rats were everywhere, thriving alongside people in towns and villages, feeding on scraps, grain, and waste. And with them came not only inconvenience, but disease. Into this uneasy balance stepped the rat catchers, men who built their lives around the dangerous, unpleasant, and strangely necessary task of hunting down rodents. The job of a rat catcher might sound odd today, but in the Middle Ages it was both essential and surprisingly respected. Rats devoured food stores, spread filth, and carried fleas that could pass along devastating illnesses, including the dreaded plague. In towns where food security was fragile and sanitation was poor, unchecked rat populations could lead to hunger, sickness, and even death. Rat catchers filled the gap where other measures failed. While cats were common in villages, and dogs sometimes hunted rodents, professional rat catchers made their living by actively reducing the numbers that infested barns, kitchens, and even castles. For many families, hiring one was an act of desperation, and perhaps, in their eyes, a form of protection. A rat catcher's tools were simple yet effective. Some carried sacks, clubs, or sticks, chasing rodents into corners where they could be captured. Others used terriers, small fierce dogs trained to dive into burrows and flush out rats with astonishing efficiency. Cats, too, were used as partners, although their independent nature made them less predictable. But the strangest tool of all may have been poison. Early mixtures of arsenic and herbs were spread where rats gathered. These were dangerous not only to the animals, but to anyone who handled or consumed them by mistake. It was not uncommon for a careless rat catcher to suffer from his own remedies, a hazard that added to the grim reputation of the trade. Rat catchers did not simply work in fields or storehouses. They were often called into homes, inns, or monasteries. Imagine the unease of a medieval family, lying awake at night in a wooden house, hearing scratching in the thatch above, or feeling the quick brush of tiny claws across a floorboard. Rats were not just nuisances. They were intruders in the most intimate spaces of daily life. The presence of a rat catcher could bring relief, yet also a reminder of how fragile the boundary was between human order and the chaos of vermin. And as the rat catcher worked, crouching low, pulling up floorboards, or reaching into dark holes, he performed a kind of grim service few others were willing to undertake. The profession carried with it a strange mix of respect and suspicion. On one hand, people needed rat catchers desperately, especially during plague years. They were seen as guardians of health, protectors of food supplies, and bringers of safety to homes and towns. On the other hand, the work was unclean, associated with filth, disease, and death. Just as gong farmers, who collected human waste, were both necessary and shunned, so too were rat catchers often kept at the edge of society. They might be welcomed when needed, and avoided once their work was done. The contradiction of being both useful and repellent followed them wherever they went. In folklore and imagination, rat catchers sometimes grew larger than life. Tales circulated of men who could charm rodents with whistles or music, leading them away as if by magic. The most famous of these legends, of course, is the Pied Piper of Hamelin, a story rooted in medieval German tradition. Though wrapped in myth, it hints at the fascination people felt with the idea of someone who could rid an entire town of rats in one sweeping act. Real rat catchers were not so dramatic. Their work was dirty, drawn out, and often dangerous. Yet the connection between their trade and supernatural tales shows how deeply their role captured the imagination of the medieval world. Beyond the immediate dangers of bites, scratches, and poison, rat catchers lived under the constant shadow of disease. Rats were not the true carriers of plague. It was fleas riding on their backs. But people of the time did not understand this. They only knew that wherever rats were plentiful, sickness often followed. When the Black Death swept across Europe in the 14th century, killing millions, rat catchers were both more needed than ever and more feared. Some may have been blamed for failing to prevent outbreaks, or even suspected of harboring unholy powers. To live as a rat catcher during those years was to walk a fine line between savior and scapegoat. Their earnings varied widely. In small villages, payment might come in the form of food, drink, or a place to sleep for the night. In cities, a skilled rat catcher could earn steady wages, especially if he had the backing of local authorities. Some towns even offered bounties for dead rats, paying by the tail or head as proof. This system encouraged not only rat catching, but also occasional dishonesty, as some men bred rats in secret to collect more reward. Such stories remind us that even in the most practical jobs, human greed and ingenuity could twist necessity into opportunity. What did a rat catcher's life feel like? Imagine spending each day chasing creatures most people loathed, crawling through the dark spaces others avoided, risking sickness and injury, all for modest pay. It was a job of survival, not glory. And yet, in a strange way, it was also a job of service. The rat catcher protected families from hunger, farmers from ruin, and entire towns from infestation. He lived close to the edge of danger so that others could live with a little more peace. It is this paradox, despised yet needed, dirty yet vital, that makes the rat catcher one of the strangest and most fascinating figures in medieval society. As night falls in our story, picture a tired rat catcher making his way home. Perhaps he carries a sack filled with tails as proof of his work. Perhaps his dog trots beside him, weary but proud. The town around him grows quiet, shutters closed, candles dimmed. Tomorrow, the rats will return, and so will he. His job is never finished, because in the Middle Ages, the line between people and vermin was thin and fragile. And for all his hardships, the rat catcher remains an enduring reminder of the strange, often forgotten jobs that kept medieval life moving forward. If the rat catcher's trade seemed unpleasant, there was another medieval profession, even more notorious, the gong farmer, also known as the night soil collector. While the name may sound strange to us now, it was a polite way of describing a man whose daily labor revolved around human waste. To gong in medieval English referred to a privy or latrine, and so the gong farmer was the one who dug, emptied, and carried away what lay at the bottom of those dark, foul-smelling pits. In the great hierarchy of work, there were few tasks more necessary, and perhaps none more reviled. Imagine life in a medieval town or castle. Toilets as we know them today did not exist. In castles, there might be garderobes, small stone rooms built along outer walls, with chutes leading down to a pit or moat. In towns, public latrines could be found near marketplaces or inns, while households made do with chamber pots, which were emptied into cesspits. These cesspits filled over time, and when they grew too full or too foul, someone had to climb down and clean them out. That someone was the gong farmer. It was a job done mostly at night, for obvious reasons. By darkness, the smell and sight might cause a little less alarm, and the streets would be quieter. A gong farmer would climb down into the pit, sometimes chest deep, armed with buckets, shovels, and sheer endurance. Slowly, he would scoop out the thick, heavy contents and haul them up. Helpers, often called rakers, would then carry the night soil away in carts to be dumped outside the town walls or sold as fertilizer. The work was grueling, filthy, and dangerous, but it was also oddly valuable because the waste of one community became the nourishment of its fields. Despite their essential service, gong farmers were considered unclean in every sense. They were often forced to live apart from others, confined to the margins of society. Some records even show they were restricted from appearing in public during the day. The smell clung to them no matter how often they washed. To shake hands with a gong farmer, or even stand too close, was unthinkable for many. Yet, when the cesspits overflowed, it was they who restored order, quietly and efficiently. The dangers of the job were many. The pits themselves could emit toxic fumes, especially methane, that caused workers to faint or suffocate. There are tales of gong farmers collapsing suddenly and never climbing back up again. Accidents happened when walls of a pit caved in, burying the worker beneath. Even without catastrophe, the constant exposure to disease made their lives shorter than most. And yet, people continued to take up this trade, driven by the simple fact that society could not do without them. And because the wages, while modest, were sometimes better than those of farmhands or laborers above ground. Payment often came in the form of daily wages, though some worked under contract with towns or noble households. In London, for example, records show gong farmers being paid steady sums, sometimes even enjoying a degree of financial stability that belied their low social standing. They may have been shunned socially, but their purses were not always empty. And for men with few other options, those born poor or outcasts from other trades, the work of a gong farmer was a path to survival. What did a night in the life of a gong farmer look like? Picture him setting out at dusk, tools slung over his shoulder, perhaps accompanied by a boy or helper. The air grows cooler, but the task ahead is heavy. He reaches a cesspit at the edge of town. The stench rises before him, pungent and overwhelming. He lowers himself slowly down, bucket in hand, and begins to scoop, his arms aching, his eyes watering. Above, his companion hauls up the bucket, dumps it into a cart, and lowers it again. The rhythm continues, hour after hour, until the pit is empty or nearly so. By dawn, the carts are wheeled out beyond the walls, where the soil is heaped into piles, waiting for farmers who know its worth. And as the town awakens, the gong farmer returns home, unseen and unnoticed, to sleep through the day. The paradox of the gong farmer lies in the way society both needed and rejected him. His work touched every household, every castle, every monastery, yet he was treated as untouchable. There is a strange dignity in this contradiction, a reminder that civilization itself rests not only on kings and knights, but on men who labored in darkness, hauling away what no one else dared to face. Without them, towns would have drowned in their own waste, disease would have spread even more quickly, and the very possibility of urban life might have faltered. Even in literature, the gong farmer appears occasionally as a figure of both disgust and dark humor. Writers mocked the filth of his trade, yet could not deny its necessity. In some towns, they were even granted small privileges, exemption from certain taxes, or protection from harassment, acknowledging, however grudgingly, the value of their work. To us today, the idea of spending one's life in such labor seems unimaginable, but in the Middle Ages, it was simply another thread in the great fabric of survival. As you drift deeper into this story, let your mind settle on the image of a medieval town at rest. The streets are quiet, the fires are low, and beneath the ground, the unseen work of the gong farmers carries on. Their shovels scrape, their buckets rise and fall, their carts creak along dark paths. No one thanks them, no one honors them, yet the health and safety of all depend upon their toil. Strange though it may be, the gong farmer's story is one of the most essential in the long history of human labor. Without them, the Middle Ages would have been a far filthier and far shorter-lived world. Among the strangest professions of the medieval and early modern world, few seem more eerie than that of the sin-eater. Unlike the rat-catcher, who battled vermin, or the gong farmer, who cleared away waste, a sin-eater was believed to cleanse something far less tangible, the soul of the dead. His work took place not in dark pits or filthy alleys, but in the solemn stillness of deathbeds and graveyards. The sin-eater was not a man of medicine, nor of the church. He was an outsider who, for a small fee, would take upon himself the sins of another, so that the deceased might rest in peace. Imagine a quiet cottage on the edge of a medieval village. A family gathers around the bed of a dying loved one. Candles flicker, prayers are whispered, but fear lingers. What if the dying person has not confessed fully? What if some sins remain unshriven? In an age when the weight of the soul was a constant concern, the thought of one's spirit wandering, unrested and troubled, was unbearable. This is where the sin-eater was called. He would arrive silently, often at night, and take his place by the bedside or at the coffin. A piece of bread, perhaps some ale, would be set before him. As he ate and drank, the family believed he consumed the sins of the departed, drawing them into himself, leaving the soul purified. The origins of this ritual are murky, and though it is most often associated with rural England and Wales, the practice echoes beliefs found across many cultures. At its heart lies the idea that guilt, wrongdoing, and spiritual burden could be transferred from one body to another through a symbolic act. In a world where the line between the physical and the spiritual was often blurred, this seemed possible, even natural. To eat the bread was to take on the weight of a life's regrets. To drink the ale was to swallow the bitterness of wrongdoing. The sin-eater became, in effect, a vessel of humanity's darkest parts. But such power came at a cost. Sin-eaters were shunned by the communities they served. Though they provided a service families desperately wanted, they were also considered unclean, tainted by the very sins they absorbed. People avoided them in the streets, refused to sit beside them at meals, and treated them as outcasts. Children might whisper, pointing fingers at the strange, solitary figure who carried so many unseen burdens. In some towns, the sin-eater lived on the fringes, in huts or hovels away from others, welcomed only in times of death, and sent away again as quickly as possible. Payment for this strange service was usually meager: a few coins, a loaf of bread, a mug of ale. The work was not done for wealth. but for survival. Many sin-eaters were poor men with little choice, driven to accept such grim labor. Yet the ritual carried with it a solemn dignity. Families believed they had secured peace for their loved ones, a final act of love and duty. And so, despite the scorn and suspicion, the role endured for centuries, whispered about, but rarely acknowledged openly. The Church, unsurprisingly, condemned the practice. Priests declared it heretical, a dangerous superstition that bypassed confession and absolution. To them, the idea that a common man, often illiterate and untrained, could cleanse sins through bread and ale was blasphemy. Yet in villages far from the eyes of authority, the ritual persisted. People clung to it because it gave them comfort, a sense of control in the face of death's mystery. For those left behind, the sight of a sin-eater at work meant hope that their loved one, soul, was not wandering in torment. Legends grew around these men. Some claimed that a sin-eater's eyes grew darker with each ritual, as though the sins of others stained them. Others believed that a sin-eater would suffer terribly in the afterlife, burdened by all the wickedness he had consumed. To see one walking in daylight was to be reminded of all that was hidden in the human heart. The very sight could unsettle villagers who crossed themselves or turned away, yet still sent for him when death came to their door. What was it like to live as a sin-eater? Picture him walking alone down a dirt road, his clothes worn, his face lined with care. He has eaten the bread of a dozen dying men, swallowed the bitterness of a dozen guilty souls. He carries the knowledge that no priest will absolve him, that no community will welcome him. Yet when the bell tolls, or when a messenger knocks on his door, he goes willingly, stepping into rooms heavy with grief, accepting his portion of bread and ale, taking into himself the sorrow of others. He is both reviled and needed, forgotten and indispensable. His existence is a paradox, a reflection of the deep fear and hope that shaped medieval life. As centuries passed, the practice faded, lingering longest in remote rural places. By the 18th and 19th centuries, sin-eaters were rare, remembered more in whispers and tales than in regular practice. Writers recorded their existence with fascination, noting how they embodied both superstition and compassion. Today, the figure of the sin-eater survives mostly in legend, literature, and imagination. Yet his story reveals something profound about the human need for release, the desire to believe that sins can be set aside, carried away, and that peace can be found even at the edge of death. As you rest here in the quiet of this story, let your mind drift to a dimly lit room long ago. The candles glow, the air is heavy with incense and grief. A family watches as the sin-eater lifts a piece of bread to his lips, chews slowly, and drinks from a cup. The ritual is simple, but in their hearts, it means everything. They sigh in relief, believing the soul of their loved one is lighter, freer, at peace. The sin-eater rises, silent, and leaves without a word, fading into the night. His work is done, though his burden grows heavier. It is one of the strangest jobs of the medieval world, and yet one of the most hauntingly human. Of all the strange professions in the Middle Ages, few combined danger, necessity, and sheer unpleasantness like the work of the leech collector. Today, we may think of leeches as little more than disgusting creatures, slimy worms that cling to the skin and suck blood. But in the medieval world, they were regarded as valuable tools of medicine, and those who gathered them played an important part in the healing practices of their time. The work was not glamorous, and it was often dangerous, but it reveals much about how people once understood the body, disease, and the delicate balance of life. To understand the role of the leech collector, we must step into the mindset of medieval medicine. Doctors believed in the theory of the four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Good health, they thought, depended on keeping these humors in balance. When a person fell ill, it was often believed that one humor had grown too strong and needed to be reduced. Bloodletting became a common treatment, and leeches were among the favored tools for this task. A leech, once placed on the skin, would latch on and drink steadily, removing blood in a way that seemed both natural and controlled. It was less violent than cutting a vein with a knife, and in some cases, doctors believed it was more effective. But before a leech could be used in a sick room, someone had to gather it, and that was the work of the leech collector. These men and women ventured into marshes, ponds, and rivers where leeches lived in abundance. With no nets or clever traps at first, they used their own bodies as bait. A collector would wade into the water, often barefoot, sometimes standing for hours. Soon, the small black leeches would sense the warmth and the promise of blood, attaching themselves to the collector's legs. When enough had gathered, the collector would step out, carefully plucking them off and storing them in jars, gourds, or cloth sacks filled with damp moss. The process was simple, but far from easy. The dangers were real. A leech bite itself was not usually deadly, but repeated exposure left collectors weak, anemic, and vulnerable to infection. Some would faint after losing too much blood. Others suffered from lingering sores or fevers caused by the wounds. In cold climates, standing waist-deep in water for hours risked illness from the chill. It was a job of patience, endurance, and sacrifice, and yet it was often done by the poorest members of society who had no other means of survival. Women, widows, and children sometimes took up the work, walking into ponds with bare legs, emerging pale and trembling, but with a small fortune in wriggling leeches. Despite the risks, leech collecting could be profitable. Leeches were in high demand, not only in small villages, but also in great cities and royal courts. Apothecaries and physicians bought them in bulk, keeping them in jars ready for patients. In some regions, leech collecting became an organized trade, with entire families specializing in it for generations. Markets saw jars of leeches sold alongside herbs and ointments, a reminder that the line between medicine and discomfort was often thin. A good collector, who knew the right ponds and the right times of year, could make a modest but steady living. The cultural view of leech collectors was complex. On one hand, they were providers of healing tools, essential to the medical practices of their time. On the other, their work was seen as lowly, messy, and unpleasant. Like rat catchers and gong farmers, they existed on the margins, performing work few wanted, but everyone needed. In some stories, leech collectors were mocked or pitied, described as ragged figures standing in swamps, covered in mud, their legs scarred with bites. Yet without them, doctors could not perform one of the most common treatments of the age. Over time, the methods of collecting grew slightly more advanced. Some collectors used animals, letting livestock wade into ponds and then removing the leeches afterward. Others devised traps with meat or skins placed in the water to lure the creatures. But still, the most reliable way remained the simplest, the human body itself. In this, leech collecting was not just a job, but a strange kind of symbiosis, where humans offered their own blood in exchange for the creatures that would later take blood from others. It was a cycle of sacrifice, repeating endlessly across the centuries. The leeches themselves were carefully tended once collected. They were kept in earthen jars or wooden containers filled with water and moss, carried to towns where apothecaries sold them to patients. A doctor might prescribe leeching for fevers, headaches, gout, or even melancholy. People believed that by drawing out blood, they could draw out sickness. And while modern medicine shows us that this was rarely effective, the persistence of the practice shows how deeply people longed for ways to control their health in uncertain times. Imagine, for a moment, the life of a medieval leech collector. The morning mist clings to the surface of a pond. He or she wades slowly into the water, feeling the mud squelch between bare toes. The surface ripples as the first leeches stir. Soon, small shapes brush against the skin, then attach firmly, pulling, feeding. The collector stands still, patient, enduring the sting and the slow drain of blood. When enough cling to the legs, the collector bends, removes them one by one, drops them into a jar, and then steps back into the water to begin again. Hours pass in this rhythm until the jar is full and the body is weary. The sun rises higher and the collector walks home, tired, cold, and pale, carrying a small treasure that will one day be used in the chambers of kings or the huts of peasants alike. The story of leech collectors reminds us how different, and yet how human, the Middle Ages were. People faced sickness with fear and hope, turning to the tools they knew, however imperfect. Collectors gave their strength, their blood, and sometimes their lives so that others might believe in healing. Their work may seem grim to us now, but it was woven deeply into the rhythm of medieval life, a strange profession born from the needs of a world still learning to understand itself. As you drift with this story, picture the quiet stillness of a marsh at dawn. The water shimmers, the reeds sway, and a lone figure stands waist-deep, waiting, enduring, offering blood for blood. The work is thankless, the reward small, but the purpose, in its own strange way, is noble. And in that stillness, we see another of the strange, forgotten jobs that kept the Middle Ages alive. Among the many unusual roles that existed in the lives of medieval and early modern people, one of the strangest, and perhaps saddest, was that of the whipping boy. This was not a profession born of necessity in the marketplace, nor of survival in the fields or towns. Instead, it arose within the gilded walls of royal courts, where the lives of princes were so precious that no punishment could touch them directly. And so, in a strange twist of logic, another child would be chosen to bear the pain that the prince himself had earned. This child was the whipping boy. To understand how such a practice could exist, one must remember the mindset of the age. Kings were seen as chosen by God, and their children, destined to inherit, were considered too sacred to be struck by ordinary hands. Even teachers or tutors, responsible for guiding a young prince in his studies, could not dare to lift a rod against him. To do so would be to insult the royal bloodline itself. Yet princes were children all the same, mischievous, rebellious, sometimes lazy in their studies. They needed discipline, and so the peculiar solution was devised. A companion, often of noble, but lesser birth, who would be raised alongside the prince, sharing his lessons and his play, but also his punishments. Imagine a classroom in a royal palace. The young prince sits at his desk, distracted, perhaps more interested in the view from the window than the book in front of him. His tutor grows stern, warning him to attend. Still the boy ignores the lesson, doodling or whispering to his companion. Finally, the tutor calls for order. But instead of punishing the prince, he turns to the companion, the whipping boy. A rod or switch is brought forth, and the unfortunate boy receives lashes across his back or hands. The prince watches, perhaps wincing, perhaps laughing, but always reminded that his own misbehavior causes suffering. The pain is meant not for him, but for another, and in that reflection, the lesson is supposed to sink deeper. The logic was clear, if harsh. By making another suffer in his place, the prince was to feel guilt and shame, knowing that his friend endured punishment for his mistakes. The hope was that this would teach him responsibility and self-control. Whether this method worked is another question. Some princes, perhaps sensitive by nature, grew deeply attached to their whipping boys, feeling genuine sorrow each time the rod fell. Others, spoiled and arrogant, may have taken the arrangement as a form of amusement, mocking the boy who bore their stripes. The relationship between prince and whipping boy could therefore range from close companionship to cruel indifference. Whipping boys were not random servants plucked from the street. They were often chosen from families of lower nobility, educated and raised within the palace. The intention was that they would be suitable companions for a prince, sharing his games, meals, and lessons. In this sense, they lived lives of privilege compared to most children of their time. They wore fine clothes, ate good food, and received an education few others enjoyed. But all of this came at the price of being the vessel for pain, the one upon whom discipline fell again and again. Their lives were a mixture of honor and humiliation, comfort and cruelty. The emotional bonds that grew in this strange arrangement are hard to imagine. Some whipping boys became lifelong friends of the princes they served. Their shared childhoods, however unequal, forged ties of loyalty and affection. In certain cases, these bonds lifted the whipping boy into positions of influence later in life. History tells us of men who began as whipping boys and later served as trusted advisors or courtiers, their intimacy with the prince giving them a unique closeness to power. Others, less fortunate, faded into obscurity once their role was no longer needed, carrying the scars, physical and emotional, of a childhood spent in the shadow of another's destiny. It is worth noting that the practice of whipping boys, though famous, was not universal across all of Europe. Some historians debate how common it truly was, suggesting that it may have been more symbolic or limited to particular courts. Yet the stories of its existence persisted, retold in chronicles and later embellished in literature. Whether it was an everyday reality for many princes or a rare peculiarity, it has captured the imagination for centuries, a stark example of how the structures of hierarchy shaped even the most intimate details of childhood. To picture the daily life of a whipping boy is to see contrasts. One moment he runs in the gardens with the prince, laughing as they chase each other through the hedges. The next, he kneels before the tutor, grimacing as the rod strikes, while the prince sits beside him, guilty but untouched. He eats at a fine table, yet feels the sting of discipline not for his own deeds, but for those of another. He is both privileged and punished, honored and degraded, a paradox of the medieval world's obsession with status and divine right. As time passed, the idea of the whipping boy became a subject of fascination for writers and storytellers. In later centuries, it was sometimes used as a metaphor for anyone who suffers in another's place, a scapegoat for the faults of the powerful. The very strangeness of the practice, its mixture of cruelty and logic, makes it memorable. It shows us how differently people once thought about power, punishment, and the sacredness of bloodlines. As you let your thoughts drift with this tale, imagine the soft light of a royal study in the early morning. A boy prince sits at his lessons, restless and unwilling. His tutor scolds him, but the rod does not fall on his shoulders. Instead, it turns toward his companion, the faithful whipping boy who braces himself in silence. The lash stings, the lesson is taught, and the day moves on. It is a strange image, both cruel and tender, a reminder that even in the highest places, childhood was shaped by the peculiar customs of its time. And so the story of the whipping boy joins the long list of strange medieval professions, not a job chosen freely, but one bound to the strange needs of kings and princes, one that reveals how power and privilege shaped even the simplest acts of discipline. Among the many strange and unsettling roles in history, few stir the imagination, quite like the resurrectionist, more commonly known as the body snatcher. Unlike the rat catcher, who dealt with pests, or the leech collector, who gathered tools of healing, the resurrectionist dealt with something most people feared deeply: the dead. His job was to steal bodies from graveyards under the cover of night and sell them to doctors and universities eager to study the mysteries of the human form. It was an occupation born not of tradition, but of desperate demand, and it thrived in the uneasy shadows between science and superstition. To understand why such a job existed, we must recall how little was known about the human body in the Middle Ages and even into the early modern period. Doctors and students of medicine yearned to learn more about anatomy, about how muscles worked, how organs functioned, how illness spread. But the church often forbade the dissection of corpses, seeing it as a violation of the sacred body. Graves were to remain undisturbed, their occupants resting until the day of resurrection. This left scholars with very few opportunities to study real human bodies, and without such knowledge, progress in medicine was painfully slow. And yet, curiosity and necessity pushed people forward. By the late Middle Ages, some universities and physicians began quietly seeking corpses for study, and where there was demand, supply soon followed. Resurrectionists, men willing to risk the law, their souls, and their reputations, slipped into graveyards by lantern light, digging swiftly and silently, lifting the fresh dead from their resting places. These bodies were smuggled into towns and sold to surgeons who paid in coin, often discreetly, with no questions asked. The practice was grim, but it fed the hunger for knowledge that would one day transform medicine. The work was fraught with danger. Graveyards were places of fear, associated with spirits and curses. To disturb the dead was thought to invite misfortune, if not outright damnation. Resurrectionists carried not only shovels and sacks, but also courage enough to face the howling wind and the weight of superstition. They worked quickly, often in groups, one digging while another kept watch for guards or grieving families. A single cry of alarm could bring disaster. To be caught body snatching meant severe punishment, imprisonment, or worse. In some towns, angry mobs took justice into their own hands, beating or even killing those they found defiling graves. The irony of their work was that resurrectionists rarely dealt in wealth or luxury. Despite the risks, the money was not always great. They were often poor laborers, driven by desperation, lured by the promise of coin that might keep hunger at bay. A new society despised them. Its society's doctors quietly relied on them. It was a hidden partnership. One group advancing science, the other enduring stigma, each needing the other while pretending not to. Imagine the scene of their nightly labor. The moon is hidden behind clouds, the churchyard silent except for the rustle of wind through trees. A small group of men slip over the wall, carrying spades. They choose a fresh grave, the earth still loose. Working in near silence, they dig, their breath quick, their hands calloused. The spade strikes wood, the coffin is pried open, and the still body within is lifted out, wrapped in cloth, placed in a sack. The earth is returned, tamped down so the grave appears untouched. Then they vanish into the night, leaving behind a quiet plot that hides their theft. By dawn, the body is delivered to a doctor's door, payment exchanged, and the cycle begins again. The reputation of resurrectionists was understandably grim. They were seen as defilers, men without respect for the sacred rest of the dead. Stories painted them as ghouls, sneaking through cemeteries, trading in shadows. Parents warned their children not to wander near graveyards, lest the resurrection men catch them. And yet, in a strange twist, their work helped to unlock truths that would one day save lives. Without their illicit trade, many medical students would never have seen the inside of a human body, never have learned how to set bones properly, or how to understand the placement of organs. The progress of anatomy was built, quite literally, upon their dark labor. Folklore often surrounded these men. Some believed they carried charms or spells to ward off spirits angered by their work. Others thought they grew cold and heartless, untouched by fear or guilt, as if the dead themselves had hardened them. But in reality, most resurrectionists were ordinary men caught in extraordinary circumstances, driven by poverty and pulled into a world few would willingly choose. They lived dangerous, hidden lives, despised by the very society that, in secret, depended on them. The practice continued well beyond the Middle Ages, into the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries. In later times, it became a widespread scandal, with newspapers reporting grave robberies and public outrage swelling. Laws eventually changed, allowing bodies of executed criminals or unclaimed corpses to be used for study, slowly reducing the need for such thefts. But in the medieval world, when belief and superstition held stronger sway, the resurrectionist was an especially shocking figure, one who walked the fine line between knowledge and damnation. As you let this story settle in your mind, imagine again the silent graveyard, the soft scrape of a spade, the flicker of a lantern shielded by a cloak. The men work quickly, knowing each second increases their risk. To them, the dead body is not a sacred vessel, but a prize, a chance for coin, a means of survival. To the doctors, it is a source of learning. To the families, it is a violation beyond words. This triangle of need, greed, and grief created one of the strangest, most unsettling jobs of the medieval and early modern world: the resurrectionist, the body snatcher, the one who turned rest into commerce. In this tale, we see again the strangeness of human history, how even the darkest trades were shaped by need, how survival and curiosity drove men to walk paths both feared and forbidden. And as unsettling as it may be, the resurrectionist's spade helped carve the way toward a deeper understanding of life itself. Amidst the strange and sometimes grim professions of the Middle Ages, there also existed roles that reflected compassion, duty, and charity. One such role was that of the almoner. Unlike the rat-catcher or the resurrectionist, whose work lurked in shadows and filth, the almoner's task was tied to generosity, to the distribution of wealth and food to the poor. It was a job rooted in the religious and social values of the time. Yet even here, the role carried its own peculiar qualities that set it apart from the world we know today. The word almoner comes from alms, the act of giving to those in need. In a medieval monastery, cathedral, or noble household, the almoner was the official charged with handling such giving. He ensured that the poor received bread, clothing, and sometimes coins from the hands of the wealthy or the church. On the surface, it might seem a straightforward duty of kindness. Yet the almoner was more than a mere distributor. He was a figure who represented the intersection of charity, control, and spiritual duty, a reminder that in the Middle Ages, giving was not just generosity, but also a way of managing society. Imagine a great abbey in the 12th century, its stone walls towering above the countryside. Pilgrims and beggars gather at its gates, weary from travel, hungry from days of wandering. The almoner appears, robed simple but neat, carrying baskets of bread. With measured calm, he hands out food, sometimes with words of blessing, sometimes with stern reminders of obedience. Each act of giving is both a gesture of kindness and a performance of authority. For the poor, it is survival. For the abbey, it is an expression of Christian duty, fulfilling the command to care for the least fortunate. And for the almoner, it is a daily role that combines mercy with management. The responsibilities of an almoner could be wide-ranging. In monasteries, he oversaw the almonry, a special room or office where food and alms were distributed. He might keep records of what was given and to whom, ensuring fairness and preventing waste. In noble households, the almoner not only handed out alms, but also managed the image of generosity that the family wished to project. Giving to the poor was not merely kindness. It was also a way to display piety, to earn favor in the eyes of both God and society. The almoner, then, was as much a steward of reputation as of charity. But like many medieval roles, the work carried contradictions. To some, the almoner was a figure of relief, the one who opened the doors when hunger gnawed. To others, he was a gatekeeper, deciding who received aid and who did not. His word could mean the difference between comfort and despair. There are records of almoners being stern, even harsh, turning away those they judged unworthy. In this way, the almoner's task was not always gentle. It was also about maintaining order, distinguishing the deserving poor from the undeserving, shaping how charity itself was experienced. Beyond daily distributions, almoners often managed larger charitable works. Some supervised hospitals or hospices attached to monasteries, ensuring that the sick and weary were cared for. Others arranged for masses to be said on behalf of the poor, or for dowries to be provided for orphaned girls. Their influence extended beyond bread and coin, shaping the very structures of medieval charity. And yet, despite the importance of their work, almoners rarely held the same prestige as higher-ranking clerics or household officers. They worked in the margins between wealth and poverty, carrying responsibility without much recognition. The role also reveals how deeply medieval society wove together faith and daily life. Giving alms was not just social kindness, but a spiritual obligation. To feed the poor was to follow Christ's example. To clothe the naked was to gain merit for one's soul. Many nobles and abbots relied on almoners to fulfill this duty in their name. In doing so, they believed they secured blessings and reduced the weight of their own sins. The almoner became, in a sense, an intermediary between the wealthy and the poor, ensuring that the flow of charity also served the flow of spiritual benefit. What might a day in the life of an almoner look like? Imagine the morning bells tolling in a monastery. The monks gather for prayer, while outside the gate a crowd of beggars gathers. The almoner appears, arms full of loaves baked in the abbey's kitchens. Slowly, he hands them out one by one, speaking softly, sometimes pausing to offer water or a kind word. Later, he records the day's distributions in a ledger, tallying the abbey's resources. In the afternoon, he might visit the sick, carrying broth to those too weak to walk. By evening, he sits with the abbot, discussing the needs of the poor and the reputation of the monastery. His day is a balance of service and duty, compassion and calculation. The almoner's role extended even to great events. At royal courts, for example, kings and queens often had almoners organized vast acts of charity. On feast days, hundreds of poor might be fed, with food and clothing distributed in the monarch's name. These grand spectacles of generosity were carefully planned by the almoner, ensuring that the ruler's image as a pious and merciful sovereign was upheld. Here again, we see how charity was never just about kindness, but about the careful weaving of power, image, and faith. In some ways, the almoner's job may seem less strange than that of a sin-eater or a gong farmer. After all, it dealt not with filth or superstition, but with kindness. Yet its strangeness lies in the structure around it. Today, we think of charity as something deeply personal, given freely and without expectation. In the Middle Ages, it was formalized, managed, and often used as a tool of authority. The almoner was the figure at the heart of this system, turning the spiritual obligation of giving into a daily routine, and in doing so, shaping the lives of countless poor men and women who came to the gates of abbeys and castles with empty hands and hopeful eyes. As you rest with this story, imagine the slow rhythm of an almoner's work. Bread passed into waiting hands, coins dropped into palms, a quiet blessing murmured at the threshold of a monastery. In these small acts, lives were sustained, faith was affirmed, and society's fragile balance between wealth and poverty was maintained. The almoner may not have wielded power in the way of kings or knights, but in his quiet service, he left a mark upon the medieval world, a reminder that even among the strangest jobs, there was room for mercy and compassion. When we think of the Middle Ages, few images are as haunting or as instantly recognizable as that of the plague doctor. Cloaked in dark robes, with gloves, boots, and a wide-brimmed hat, his face hidden behind a mask with a long, bird-like beak, the plague doctor looks almost otherworldly, like a figure from a nightmare. Yet for many communities facing the terror of epidemic disease, this strange, unsettling figure represented hope, protection, and the faint promise of survival. To step into the life of a plague doctor is to step into one of the most frightening and fascinating professions of the medieval and early modern world. The plague, most famously the Black Death of the 14th century, was one of the greatest disasters in human history. Sweeping across Europe, it claimed the lives of millions, wiping out villages, emptying cities, and reshaping society. Its symptoms were terrifying: sudden fevers, swollen and painful buboes, blackened skin, and death within days. People were desperate for answers, desperate for help. But medicine in those times was still bound by limited knowledge. Doctors did not understand germs or bacteria. Instead, they worked within the framework of humors, miasmas, and divine punishment. And into this chaos, plague doctors emerged, not always trained physicians, but men hired by towns and cities to tend to the sick, record the dead, and if possible, treat the disease. The costume of the plague doctor is what captures our imagination today. It was designed less for style and more for survival, or at least the hope of it. The heavy cloak, coated in wax or oils, was thought to shield the body from poisonous air. Gloves and boots protected the hands and feet from contact. The wide-brimmed hat marked the man as a physician. And then there was the mask. Its glass eyepieces gave the appearance of dark, lifeless eyes, and its long curved beak jutted outward like that of a carrion bird. Inside the beak, herbs, spices, and vinegar-soaked cloth were stuffed, believed to purify the air. Doctors thought that plague spread through foul smells, through a miasma of corruption, and so they attempted to filter each breath through perfumes and pungent remedies. To the people of the time, the sight of such a figure walking the streets was both terrifying and strangely reassuring, a sign that someone, however strange, was trying to fight the invisible enemy. The duties of plague doctors varied. Some were hired to treat the sick, applying poultices, lancing buboes, or attempting bloodletting in the hope of restoring balance to the humors. Others served more as officials, recording the number of deaths, writing wills for the dying, or arranging the transport of bodies to mass graves. In some towns, plague doctors also inspected houses, marking those where illness had struck and enforcing quarantines. Their role, therefore, was both medical and bureaucratic, straddling the line between healer and grim record-keeper. For families in despair, a plague doctor might be the only outside face they saw, a strange, masked figure entering a house heavy with sickness, moving among the dying, then stepping back into the silent, fearful streets. Despite the protective costume, plague doctors were in constant danger. Their clothing offered little true defense against fleas, the real carriers of the disease. Many fell ill themselves, dying after only weeks or months of service. Yet there were always more willing to take up the role, for the pay was often good. Cities desperate for help offered high salaries, housing, and even pensions for the families of those who served. Some plague doctors were outsiders, foreign physicians who traveled from place to place, offering their services in exchange for coin. Others were not doctors at all, but men with little training, drawn by the promise of wealth, willing to risk their lives for money and perhaps a strange kind of notoriety. The presence of plague doctors also fed superstition and fear. Their eerie appearance, their dealings with the sick and the dead, made them seem almost spectral. Some saw them as omens, believing that where the plague doctor walked, death followed. Children were frightened of them, hiding their faces when the black-robed figures passed. And yet, for all the fear, people also prayed for their arrival, knowing that without them, there would be no one to tend to the dying, no one to record the names of the lost. One can imagine the daily routine of a plague doctor. He wakes in a small chamber, dons the heavy layers of his costume, and adjusts the strange mask until it fits tightly. With each breath, a sharp scent of herbs fills his nose. Outside, the streets are quiet, shutters closed, but here and there, a cart creaks by, laden with bodies for the grave. He enters a house marked with a painted cross where a family lies stricken. He examines a patient, notes the swellings, offers what little treatment he knows, and writes down the man's final words as he dictates a will. Then he steps outside, the sound of weeping echoing behind him, and walks on to the next house, the next bed, the next sorrow. His life is a chain of sickness and grief, bound together by duty and by the faint hope that his mask, his cloak, and his herbs will keep death at bay. The strangeness of the plague doctor lies not only in his appearance, but in the contradictions of his role. He was both healer and undertaker, both a source of comfort and a harbinger of fear. His methods were primitive, yet they carried the weight of authority. His very presence was a reminder of how fragile life was, and how desperately people clung to any form of protection, no matter how strange. In him, we see the medieval world grappling with forces it could not understand, inventing rituals and costumes to hold back the tide of death. Today, the image of the plague doctor endures, not because his treatments were effective, but because his figure embodies the mixture of fear, hope, and mystery that defined the Middle Ages. His mask has become a symbol, appearing in festivals, plays, and even modern art, a reminder of a time when the boundary between science and superstition was thin, and when survival itself felt like a fragile thread. As you rest with this story, picture the slow steps of a plague doctor through an empty street, the tap of his staff on the cobblestones, the soft rustle of his cloak. Behind his mask, his breath draws through herbs and vinegar. Around him, the world is hushed, heavy with fear. And yet he continues, house by house, family by family, a lonely guardian against a terror too vast to name. Strange though his profession was, it remains one of the most haunting and unforgettable roles of the medieval world. In the Middle Ages, when faith shaped nearly every aspect of life, the figure of the hermit was both familiar and revered. These were men, and sometimes women, who withdrew from society to live in solitude, devoting themselves to prayer, reflection, and simplicity. They were seen as holy individuals, living closer to God by stepping away from the distractions of the world. Yet not all hermits lived by choice. Some were hermits for hire, individuals who were paid or encouraged by nobles, towns, or even wealthy patrons to live lives of isolation on their behalf. It is one of the strangest and most fascinating roles of medieval society, the professional recluse. At first glance, the idea seems odd. Why would anyone pay another person to live alone in prayer and silence? The answer lies in the medieval belief that holiness could be shared, that the prayers of a righteous person could bring blessings not only upon themselves, but also upon those who supported them. A noble might sponsor a hermit to pray for his family's safety, his lands, or his soul. A town might provide food and shelter for a hermit, believing his presence would protect the community from plague or famine. Wealthy patrons gave money to hermits in the hope of gaining spiritual merit, a kind of heavenly investment. Thus, the hermit became not just a solitary figure of devotion, but also a strange kind of spiritual employee. Some hermits lived in simple huts or caves, far from settlements. Others were placed deliberately near busy roads, bridges, or village edges, where their presence could remind travelers and townsfolk of the divine. A hermit at a bridge, for example, might be thought to guard it from misfortune, his prayers acting as an invisible shield. Towns sometimes built small cells or anchorages attached to churches, where a hermit would live enclosed, visible through a narrow window where food could be passed in and requests for prayers could be made. These enclosed hermits lived out their days in silence, their only connection to the outside world through that small opening, their prayers drifting outward like unseen gifts. Life as a hermit for hire was not always as austere as legend suggests. Because they were supported by patrons, some hermits received regular supplies of food, clothing, and firewood. They might even enjoy a modest degree of comfort compared to peasants who toiled in fields. Yet the price of this support was their solitude, their endless cycle of prayer, and the weight of others' expectations. The hermit was supposed to embody holiness, to resist temptation, to live without the pleasures of society. If a hermit was caught wandering too far, or indulging in worldly comforts, his reputation could be ruined. People expected their hermits to suffer on their behalf, to sacrifice freedom for the sake of collective blessing. There was, of course, another layer of strangeness. Not all hermits were truly holy, and not all lived up to the image people wanted. Some accepted the role simply because it offered survival. A man with no land, no trade, and no family might find that becoming a hermit for hire provided food and shelter. To villagers, it was enough that he lived alone and prayed. His true devotion was harder to judge. Stories circulated of hermits who grew lazy, who drank too much of the ale brought to them, or who slipped out at night to mingle in taverns. Others may have begun with sincere devotion, only to struggle with loneliness, despair, or temptation. The life of a hermit was idealized, but in reality, it was often harsh and deeply human. One of the most curious aspects of hermits for hire is how they became symbols of public identity. A town with a resident hermit could boast of its piety. A noble with a hermit on his land could claim to be a protector of holiness. Hermits were woven into the social fabric, at once isolated and yet deeply connected. They were outsiders by design, yet insiders in the sense that their lives were sponsored, watched, and valued. The paradox of their role makes them one of the most intriguing of medieval professions, both apart from the world and employed by it. Imagine the daily life of such a hermit. At dawn, he rises in a small cell, stone walls cold and damp. Through a narrow window, a villager slides in a loaf of bread and a pitcher of water. He kneels in prayer, murmuring words for the souls of his patrons, the health of the town, the safety of travelers. Hours pass in silence. Outside, children dare each other to peek into the narrow slit, catching a glimpse of the strange figure within. Travelers pass, crossing themselves as they walk by, comforted by the thought that the hermit's prayers shield them. At night, the hermit lies down on a rough bed, listening to the sounds of the village outside, present yet absent, seen yet unseen. For those who supported hermits, the arrangement carried spiritual comfort. To know that someone was constantly praying on their behalf was a reassurance in a world full of uncertainty, plague, famine, war, and sin. The hermit was a kind of living talisman, a reminder that holiness still existed amidst the troubles of daily life. And for the hermit, whatever his true faith or weakness, the role provided survival, and perhaps even a sense of purpose. Over time, the tradition of hermits for hire waned, replaced by other religious practices and institutions. Yet their legacy endures in the stories, legends, and ruins left behind. Some hermitages still stand, small stone rooms attached to old churches, silent reminders of the lives once lived within. Their existence speaks to a world where solitude was not only respected, but also commodified, turned into a strange kind of profession. As you let this story settle, imagine a quiet village at dusk. Smoke rises from chimneys, children are called inside, and in a small stone cell at the edge of the churchyard, a hermit kneels in prayer. He prays for the farmers, for the travelers, for the noble family who sends him bread. Alone, yet bound to everyone, he embodies the paradox of the Middle Ages, where holiness could be hired, where solitude could be sponsored, and where even silence itself became a strange profession. In the long sweep of medieval history, where castles rose against the sky and cathedrals stretched heavenward, many of the grandest achievements of stone and wood were built not only with skill, but also with sweat and muscle. Among the most curious contributors to this world of construction and labor were the treadmill operators. Their job was to walk endlessly, often in great wooden wheels, using their own weight and motion to power cranes, lifts, and machinery. It is a strange and somewhat humbling thought that some of the most awe-inspiring works of the age, from cathedrals to bridges, relied upon men walking in circles, hour after hour, like human hamsters in giant wheels. The medieval treadmill crane was a marvel of its time. Picture a massive wooden wheel, large enough for a man to stand inside, sometimes even wide enough for two. Attached to gears, pulleys, and ropes, The wheel transformed the steady motion of walking into the lifting power needed to hoist heavy stones high into the air. Cathedral walls that reached dizzying heights, castle towers that loomed over the countryside, these feats depended on such machines. Without treadmills and the men who walked within them, construction would have been slower, riskier, and perhaps impossible on the same scale. Their work required no special training beyond the ability to walk steadily and withstand exhaustion. But while the task may sound simple, it was grueling. Each step carried the weight of stone blocks rising into the air. The wheel creaked and groaned, the ropes strained, and the men inside sweated as they marched endlessly, often for hours without pause. The risk of accidents was constant. A slip could send a man tumbling within the wheel, injuring himself or throwing the entire mechanism off balance. A snapped rope could cause a stone to plummet, endangering workers below. Yet for all these dangers, the work continued, for the demand for construction in the Middle Ages was immense. They were part of the army of laborers, masons, carpenters, blacksmiths, and haulers, whose combined efforts raised the great monuments of the era. Their names were rarely recorded, their faces lost to history, but their footprints echoed in the stones that still stand today. Each block lifted into place by their steady steps remains a silent testament to their unseen labor. What might a day in the life of a treadmill operator look like? Imagine arriving at the base of a half-built cathedral in the early morning. The air is filled with the sound of hammers striking chisels, voices shouting orders, and the crack of wood being cut. A rope tightens, a pulley creaks, and far above, a block of stone rises, inch by inch. You keep walking, legs burning, sweat dripping, the world outside reduced to the endless circle of motion beneath your feet. Hours pass like this, broken only by brief rests. When your shift ends, another man takes your place, and the cycle begins again. The treadmill operator's role extended beyond construction. In some prisons, treadmills were introduced not as tools of progress, but as instruments of punishment. Prisoners were forced to walk for hours, driving wheels that ground grain or pumped water. For them, the wheel was not a means of building cathedrals, but a reminder of discipline, a symbol of endless labor imposed as penance. In this way, the treadmill became both a tool of creation and a tool of control, shaping not only stone, but also human lives. For medieval treadmill operators, however, the motion was anything but pointless. The paradox is striking. What appears monotonous and endless was in fact the heartbeat of progress, the steady pulse that raised monuments of faith and power. Though we rarely think of them, the treadmill operators were as vital to the Middle Ages as the masons who carved the stones or the architects who designed the spires. But also by the steady footsteps of nameless men who walked in circles so that others could look up in wonder. As you rest with this story, imagine the sound of the wheel turning slowly, the steady rhythm of feet on wood, the groan of ropes lifting weight high into the sky. In the days before newspapers, radios, or the endless hum of digital screens, the spread of news relied not on paper or machines, but on people. Among the most distinctive voices of medieval towns and villages were those of the town criers. These men, sometimes women, walked the streets with a bell, drum, or staff, calling out official announcements, proclamations, and bits of local information. Their voices carried across markets and alleyways, their words binding communities together. The town crier was both messenger and performer, a human link between the rulers and the ruled, the powerful and the ordinary. In their shouts and proclamations, the life of the town unfolded. Imagine a busy medieval marketplace. Merchants shout about their goods, chickens squawk in baskets, children chase one another through the crowd. Suddenly, a loud, clear voice cuts through the din. The town crier has arrived. He rings his bell, calling for silence, and as the crowd quiets, he unrolls a parchment. With careful enunciation, he declares the latest law, the decision of a council, or the price of grain set by authority. His words are official, binding, and must be heard. Once finished, he moves on, repeating the message at other corners of the town until the news has spread to every ear. The role of the town crier was essential in a world where most people could not read or write. Even if a law or decree was posted on a door or written in a ledger, it would have been meaningless to the majority. The crier turned text into sound, making sure that all, rich or poor, literate or illiterate, knew what the authorities decreed. In this sense, the crier was not merely a herald of words, but a guardian of information, ensuring that no one could claim ignorance of the rules of the land. Criers delivered more than laws. They announced executions and punishments, festivals and markets, the arrival of dignitaries, and even the time of curfew. In some places, they read aloud the contents of lost and found lists, or declared goods for sale on behalf of others. Their role was a blend of official duty and public service, part government agent, part town personality. People came to recognize their voice, their style, their way of holding the crowd's attention. The best criers knew how to project, how to pace their speech, how to pause for effect. They were, in a sense, performers as much as messengers. A town crier's authority was not to be taken lightly. To interrupt or mock one was to disrespect the law itself. In many towns, criers were protected by statute, and harming them could carry serious consequences. Their words were considered legally binding, as if the ruler himself had spoken. When the crier called for silence and read from his parchment, his voice became the voice of the crown, the council, or the lord who governed the land. This gave him a strange mixture of power and vulnerability. Power because his voice carried weight, vulnerability because he was still only a man, walking among the people he addressed. The daily life of a town crier could be varied. Some days brought important decrees, a new tax, a royal marriage, the outbreak of war. Other days were more routine, reminders of market hours, warnings about thieves, or updates on road conditions. In larger cities, criers walked set routes, ensuring that no neighborhood was left uninformed. In smaller towns, a single proclamation at the marketplace might suffice. Yet in all cases, the crier had to be consistent, reliable, and above all, loud enough to be heard over the bustle of daily life. There is also a certain theatricality to imagine. Picture a crier stepping into a square, raising his bell, and shouting, "Oh yes, oh yes, oh yes, oh yes," words meaning, hear thee. The crowd turns, curious, expectant. In that moment, the crier holds their attention, commanding the ears of nobles and peasants alike. His announcement might bring cheers if it proclaims a festival, or groans if it declares a new tax. He himself may feel neither joy nor sorrow, but he is the channel through which the town feels both. Though their job was serious, criers were also part of the town's social fabric. They became familiar figures, recognizable not just by voice, but by presence. Children might mimic their calls in play. Merchants might pause their haggling to listen, grumbling, or laughing at the news. In some places, criers were remembered for their wit, adding flourishes or humor to their proclamations, even as they carried out official business. Their voices carried not only authority, but also personality, shaping the way communities experienced the flow of information. As with many medieval professions, the role of town crier carried its contradictions. They were respected for their service, yet sometimes resented as the bearers of bad news. They had authority in their voices, yet little power beyond their words. They lived in the center of public life, yet their own lives often remained humble. Still, their role was indispensable, a reminder that communication itself is a foundation of community. Even today, echoes of the town crier survive. In some towns and cities, ceremonial criers still appear at festivals, dressed in colorful uniforms, ringing bells and shouting in the old style. Though no longer needed for laws or decrees, they carry forward a tradition that once bound entire towns together. Their voices remind us of a time when news traveled not by paper or wire, but by the lungs of one determined individual, standing in a square, declaring to all who would listen. As you rest with this story, imagine the gentle hum of a medieval marketplace, slowly quieting as a bell rings. A man stands tall, voice rising above the crowd, his words rolling across the square. In his voice, the life of the town is contained, its joys, its sorrows, its duties, and its celebrations. Strange though his profession may seem today, the town crier was a vital figure of the Middle Ages, giving sound to the silent words of rulers and turning parchment into living proclamation. Among the colorful figures of medieval courts, none were as peculiar, entertaining, and paradoxical as the court jester. With bright clothes, jingling bells, and a sharp wit, the jester lived in a world that straddled humor and danger, foolishness and wisdom. To many, he seemed little more than a clown, amusing nobles with antics and jokes. But beneath the surface, the role of the jester was far more complex. He was both entertainer and critic, both servant and confidant, a man who could mock kings yet survive, and sometimes thrive because of it. His job was strange, precarious, and unlike any other in medieval life. The jester's most obvious duty was to entertain. In great halls filled with knights, nobles, and visiting dignitaries, it was the jester's task to keep spirits high. He juggled, sang, told stories, and performed acrobatics. He cracked jokes at feasts, played tricks during celebrations, and lifted the heavy atmosphere of tense courts with humor. In a world where life was often grim and uncertain, laughter was a rare and precious thing. The jester supplied it, his presence a reminder that even kings needed moments of levity. Yet the jester's value went beyond laughter. He occupied a peculiar space where he could speak truths that others dared not utter. Cloaked in the guise of foolishness, he mocked the powerful, pointed out hypocrisy, and even criticized decisions. Where a nobleman might risk exile or death for such words, the jester's humor provided a shield. His jokes carried double meanings, his stories veiled sharp insights. In this way, the jester served as a mirror, reflecting the follies of the court back to itself. A wise ruler valued this candor, using the jester's humor as a subtle form of counsel. A foolish ruler, however, might ignore or even punish the very figure meant to lighten his burdens. The jester's costume itself carried symbolism. Often brightly colored, patterned in mismatched fabrics, it set him apart visually as a figure of fun and folly. Bells sewn into his cap jingled with every movement, making him impossible to ignore. His staff, sometimes carved with a small head or doll at the end, served as both prop and symbol of his license to speak freely. Everything about his appearance shouted absurdity, yet within that absurdity lay freedom. By being labeled a fool, the jester was paradoxically free from the rules that bound others. Life as a jester was not without risk. Humor is a dangerous weapon, and a poorly timed joke could anger a noble or insult a guest. Some jesters lost their positions, and perhaps even their lives, by crossing unseen lines. Others became beloved figures, remembered for their wit and loyalty. The balance was delicate, requiring quick thinking, charm, and an instinct for reading the moods of those around them. A good jester knew when to jest and when to remain silent, when to provoke laughter and when to offer comfort through a tale or song. Not all jesters were born to the role. Some came from backgrounds of performance, actors, musicians, or storytellers who found favor in noble households. Others were chosen for physical quirks or disabilities, their differences made into curiosities for entertainment. This aspect reminds us of the darker side of medieval humor, where laughter was sometimes built on cruelty. Yet even among those who began as objects of ridicule, many jesters carved out roles of influence, proving that wit and intelligence could outshine appearances. Imagine the life of a court jester in a medieval castle. By day, he might accompany the king on hunts or sit at his side during audiences, ready to lighten the mood with a quip. By night, he performed at feasts, leaping onto tables, balancing cups, or spinning tales that made the hall roar with laughter. When the court grew tense over matters of war or politics, his humor might diffuse anger, shifting the mood with a carefully timed jest. And in quieter moments, he might sit with the ruler alone, offering not just jokes, but companionship, a rare honesty masked in laughter. The jester's influence could extend beyond the court. Some became famous, their names remembered in chronicles and stories. They were symbols of freedom within constraint, living proof that even in rigid hierarchies, one figure could laugh in the face of power and survive. They remind us that humor has always been more than entertainment. It is also a form of truth-telling, a way to pierce pretension and bring people back to their humanity. The paradox of the jester is that he was both the lowest and in some ways the most liberated figure at court. He knelt before kings, yet could mock them. He wore the costume of a fool, yet often spoke with more wisdom than those around him. His job was precarious, strange, and vital, a reminder that even in times of great seriousness, laughter and folly had their place. As you let this story settle, imagine the flickering light of a great hall at night. Nobles sit at long tables, food and wine flowing, voices raised in song. Suddenly, a bright figure leaps forward, bells jingling, voice ringing with laughter. The court erupts, the king smiles, and for a moment, the weight of the world lifts. That was the power of the jester, strange, dangerous, and unforgettable, a profession unlike any other in the medieval world. Among the strange and curious professions of the Middle Ages, few combined practicality, pleasure, and responsibility in quite the same way as the ale taster. In a world where water was often unsafe to drink, ale and beer were daily necessities. They were consumed not only at feasts and celebrations, but also at ordinary meals by both nobles and peasants alike. Brewing was everywhere, in monasteries, taverns, villages, and households, and with so much of life depending on it, there arose the need for an official who would ensure its quality and fairness. Thus entered the ale taster, a role that seems almost enviable today, someone whose job was to drink ale for the good of the community. Ale was more than just a drink in medieval society. It was nourishment, providing calories, hydration, and even a measure of safety. Children drank weak ale, women brewed for their families, and travelers carried it in flasks. But like any staple, ale could be abused by dishonest sellers or poorly prepared by careless brewers. Too much water could weaken it, poor ingredients could spoil it, or unfair prices could cheat customers. Communities needed someone to keep watch over this essential trade. The ale taster was appointed, often by local councils or manorial courts, to taste, test, and judge the drink that flowed through every tavern and household. The process was both simple and serious. An ale taster would travel from brewer to brewer, sampling the latest batches. He would test the strength of the brew, ensuring it was neither too weak nor dangerously strong. He would judge its flavor, looking for signs of spoilage or contamination. He might also measure the volume of mugs or jugs, making sure that sellers were not cheating their customers by offering short measures. Once his judgment was made, he could declare an ale fit for sale, or he could find the brewer and order the ale poured away. His word carried authority, backed by the law, and his tongue became the safeguard of public trust. Though the work sounds pleasant, it carried weight. Imagine the responsibility of standing before a brewer, tankard in hand, with villagers gathered around. A sip, a thoughtful pause, and then a declaration. This ale is good and proper, or this ale is thin and unworthy. The brewer's reputation and livelihood might hinge on those few words. To make a false judgment, whether through favoritism or carelessness, was to risk angering both neighbors and authorities. Ale tasting was not just drinking. It was governance through the senses, a strange mingling of law, taste, and community. The role of ale taster also reveals much about medieval life. It shows how central ale was to daily existence, how even the poorest relied on it, and how much trust communities placed in fairness and honesty. It also reminds us that regulation and oversight are not modern inventions. Long before governments standardized weights and measures, local ale tasters were already ensuring that what people bought was worth the price they paid. Their work was a form of consumer protection centuries ahead of its time, carried out not in offices or laboratories, but in taverns and kitchens, one sip at a time. Ale tasters were often chosen from among respected townsmen. They might be re-elected year after year if they proved fair and diligent. Some took pride in their position, seeing it as a mark of honor, a chance to serve their community. Others may have viewed it as a chore, one that required frequent rounds of drinking whether one desired it or not. Records suggest that some ale tasters grew weary of their duties, especially when fines or disputes made them unpopular. Yet others seemed to enjoy their place at the center of village life, their names remembered as guardians of the common drink. Imagine the daily rhythm of an ale taster's life. He walks into a tavern, greeted with nervous smiles from the brewer. A wooden cup is filled, foam spilling over the rim. He lifts it slowly, sniffs, then drinks, letting the taste linger on his tongue. Villagers watch, waiting for his verdict. If he nods approvingly, relief spreads through the room. The ale is safe, and business may continue. If he frowns, the mood darkens, fines are issued, and casks may be emptied into the street. His job is at once enjoyable and fraught, his sense is the judge of fairness. The strangeness of the ale taster's role lies in its mixture of pleasure and duty. To drink ale for work might seem a dream to some, yet in practice it was a heavy responsibility. Poor judgment could harm livelihoods, and dishonesty could corrode trust. And while the taster may have enjoyed good drink, he also had to endure bad, sour, spoiled, or weak brews that turned the stomach. In this, his role was not so enviable after all. He bore the burden of taste so that others could drink in safety. Ale tasting also reveals the communal nature of medieval life. Brewing was often local, done in small batches, with recipes passed down through families. Each cask reflected the labor of neighbors, and each judgment by the ale taster shaped the social fabric. When ale was good, it brought joy and fellowship. When it was poor, it sparked anger and resentment. The taster stood at the center of these emotions, a figure both respected and sometimes resented, a reminder that even pleasure required oversight. As you rest with this story, picture the glow of a medieval tavern at dusk. Candles flicker, mugs clink, laughter hums through the air. Into this warmth steps the ale taster, greeted with curiosity and tension. He lifts a cup, drinks slowly, and pronounces his judgment. Around him, the community breathes easier, knowing that their daily drink has been tested, their trust preserved. Strange though his job may seem to us now, the ale taster played a vital role in the Middle Ages, blending pleasure with responsibility and making sure that the flow of ale, the lifeblood of society, remained steady, honest, and true. In the Middle Ages, few professions blended the ordinary with the extraordinary quite like the barber surgeon. Today, when we imagine a barber, we think of someone who cuts hair, shaves beards, and keeps us looking neat. A surgeon, by contrast, belongs to the world of hospitals, scalpels, and medicine. But in medieval towns and villages, these two worlds were joined together in one curious role. The barber surgeon was both groomer and healer, tending to outward appearance and inner ailments alike. His shop was a place where a man could leave looking sharp and perhaps also stitched, bandaged, or bled. It was one of the strangest dual roles of medieval life, and it carried both usefulness and danger. The roots of this profession lie in practicality. Learned physicians, often trained in universities, dealt more with theory than with hands-on treatment. They studied the writings of ancient scholars like Galen and Hippocrates, diagnosing illnesses and prescribing remedies. But they rarely performed surgery themselves, as it was considered a lowly and even dishonorable task. Surgery was manual labor, bloody and rough. Into this gap stepped barbers. Already skilled with sharp blades, they were entrusted with procedures that required cutting. Over time, their shops became places where both grooming and minor medical procedures were performed. Thus the barber surgeon emerged, standing at the crossroads of beauty and health. The duties of a barber surgeon were many. On one hand, he trimmed beards, cut hair, and polished appearances for his customers. On the other, he performed bloodletting, a common medical treatment based on the belief that illness came from an imbalance of humors. He applied leeches, pulled teeth, stitched wounds, and even amputated limbs when necessary. In towns without hospitals, his shop might be the closest thing to an emergency clinic. People came for grooming, yes, but also for relief from pain, however crude the methods might seem to us now. The barber surgeon's tools reflected this strange duality. Alongside razors and scissors hung knives, saws, and cauterizing irons. Bowls used for washing hair might also collect blood during a letting. Jars held ointments, herbs, and bandages. The familiar barber's pole, still seen today, is said to have originated from this mix of tasks. The red stripes symbolized blood, the white symbolized bandages, and the pole itself represented the staff patients gripped while veins were opened. What now looks like a simple sign for haircuts was once a marker of a trade that mingled beauty with blood. Life as a barber surgeon required resilience. The work was not easy, and the risks were high. Infection was poorly understood, and hygiene was limited. Patients sometimes died from procedures meant to heal them. Yet the barber surgeon remained in demand, for people needed both grooming and care. In smaller villages, he might be the only figure available to treat wounds or pull a rotten tooth. In larger cities, barber surgeons formed guilds, organizing their trade and protecting their rights. They stood in a curious hierarchy, below the learned physicians, yet above untrained healers. They were craftsmen of the body, working with blades, balancing respect and suspicion. Imagine stepping into a barber surgeon's shop on a medieval street. The air smells faintly of herbs and oils, mixed with the sharper tang of blood and sweat. A man sits in a chair, a cloth around his shoulders, while the barber trims his beard with a steady hand. In the corner, another patient grimaces as his arm is bound tightly, ready for bloodletting. A bowl sits beneath, ready to catch the dark flow. Outside, townsfolk wait their turn, some for a haircut, others for relief from an aching tooth or a festering wound. The barber moves easily between them, part groomer, part healer, his hands skilled in both comfort and pain. The contradictions of the barber surgeon's role are striking. To some, he was a trusted figure, a man who could provide quick relief and make one presentable. To others, he was a risky option, his cures uncertain and his procedures dangerous. Stories circulated of botched surgeries, of limbs lost unnecessarily, of patients bled until they fainted. And yet, in a world with few alternatives, people returned again and again. His work was woven into the daily life of the community, part of the rhythm of survival. Over time, the distinction between barbers and surgeons began to sharpen. By the late Middle Ages and into the Renaissance, surgeons sought to separate themselves from barbers, claiming greater skill and dignity. Guilds split, debates raged, and the professions slowly diverged. But for centuries, the barber-surgeon embodied the strange union of two worlds, a reminder that necessity often shapes professions in unexpected ways. As you let this story unfold in your mind, picture the steady rhythm of a razor against skin, the soft snip of scissors, followed by the sharper sound of a saw cutting through bone. It is a world both ordinary and extraordinary, where one man holds the tools of vanity and survival alike. Strange though it seems, the barber-surgeon was a fixture of the medieval world, a figure whose shop served as both salon and sick-room, whose hands shaped both appearances and lives. His story reminds us of how fluid the boundaries once were between beauty, medicine, and necessity, and how even the strangest jobs were born of the simple desire to endure and to heal. In the grand tapestry of medieval life, where faith and daily existence were tightly interwoven, one of the most peculiar and controversial figures was the pardoner. This strange profession was rooted not in manual labor, but in the trade of forgiveness itself. Pardoners claimed the power to absolve sins, to sell indulgences, and to offer relics or tokens that promised salvation. To some, they were holy men bringing peace to troubled souls. To others, they were charlatans, peddling false hope for profit. Their role reveals both the deep anxieties of medieval people and the ways in which human ambition could twist even the most sacred of duties. The Church taught that sin weighed upon the soul, and that confession, penance, and absolution were necessary for salvation. Yet alongside these practices grew the idea of indulgences, spiritual pardons that reduced the punishment for sins, granted by the authority of the Church. At first, indulgences were offered for acts of piety, such as prayers, pilgrimages, or donations to good works. Over time, however, they became entangled with money. Enter the pardoner, a man who traveled from town to town, carrying documents of authority and promising forgiveness in exchange for coin. Imagine a pardoner arriving at a village. He wears a cloak embroidered with church symbols, and he carries a satchel filled with scrolls and relics. Standing in the marketplace, he raises his voice and declares that for a small payment, the faithful can secure remission of sins for themselves or for departed loved ones. He shows a parchment bearing seals and signatures, claiming authority from bishops or even from Rome itself. The villagers, fearful of purgatory and eager for mercy, step forward, dropping coins into his chest in exchange for a slip of parchment or a blessing. The pardoner moves on, richer than before, leaving behind a trail of relieved and sometimes skeptical souls. The relics that pardoners carried were another part of their strange trade. They claimed to possess bones of saints, fragments of the true cross, or vials of holy water. These objects, displayed with great ceremony, were said to hold miraculous powers. Yet many were false, bones of animals passed off as holy, bits of wood or cloth claimed to be sacred. Some pardoners grew infamous for their fraud, weaving elaborate stories to impress their audiences. The line between genuine devotion and shameless exploitation was often blurred, and the common people, eager for hope, could rarely tell the difference. Not all pardoners were corrupt. Some truly believed they were serving the faithful, spreading the mercy of the Church to villages far from cathedrals or bishops. They saw themselves as instruments of grace, bringing forgiveness to those who could not easily travel to centers of power. But the system itself invited abuse, and many pardoners succumbed to the temptation of easy profit. They became symbols of hypocrisy, their piety worn like a mask, their hearts fixed on wealth. Writers of the time seized upon them as targets of satire. Chaucer, in the Canterbury Tales, painted his pardoner as a greedy fraud, preaching against avarice while admitting his own corruption. The image stuck, and pardoners became remembered as some of the most dubious figures of the medieval Church. The work of Partners reveals much about medieval fears and hopes. The idea of purgatory, a place of cleansing fire where souls were purified before entering heaven, loomed large in the imagination. People dreaded the suffering of their loved ones after death, and they sought every possible means of easing that burden. To buy an indulgence for a departed parent or spouse was seen as an act of devotion, a way of helping them move more swiftly toward paradise. The partner, however questionable, provided a service that touched the deepest emotions of ordinary people. He gave them a sense of agency in a world where death and judgment felt overwhelming. What might a day in the life of a partner look like? Picture him rising at dawn, preparing his parchments and relics. He travels along dusty roads, arriving at a town just as the marketplace fills. He sets up his stand, lays out his tokens, and begins to preach in a booming voice. Crowds gather, curious and hopeful. He tells stories of souls lifted from torment by the power of indulgences, of miracles granted through holy relics. One by one, villagers approach, offering coins in trembling hands. The partner blesses them, handing over slips of paper or small tokens. By evening, his purse is heavier, his satchel lighter, and he moves on to the next town, his reputation trailing behind him, praised by some, cursed by others. The contradictions of the partner's profession made him both powerful and despised. He dealt in the currency of salvation, yet often lived in open sin. He offered forgiveness, yet embodied corruption. He was welcomed when people sought comfort, yet mocked as soon as he left. His life was one of constant travel, endless persuasion, and the uneasy knowledge that his trade, however profitable, was fragile and reviled. And yet, for centuries, partners thrived, feeding on the anxieties of souls longing for peace. In time, their abuses became too great to ignore. The widespread sale of indulgences became one of the sparks that ignited the Reformation in the 16th century, as figures like Martin Luther denounced the practice as a betrayal of true faith. The partner, once tolerated as part of the church's machinery, became a symbol of all that had gone wrong. His profession faded, his name stained, but his story endures as a reminder of how even the holiest of concepts can be twisted by human greed. As you let this story rest in your thoughts, picture a medieval village square, the crowd hushed as a partner holds up a parchment with shining seals. His words promise salvation, his smile promises comfort, and the coins clink into his chest. Behind the performance lies a strange truth, that people long for forgiveness so deeply they will grasp it wherever it appears. Strange though his job was, the partner's tale is one of the most telling of the Middle Ages, revealing both the hunger for grace and the shadows that human weakness can cast upon it. Among the professions of the Middle Ages, none carried more dread, more secrecy, and more contradiction than that of the executioner. His work was necessary in the eyes of kings, lords, and councils, yet it cast a long shadow over his life. He was the one who carried out sentences of death, who wielded the axe, the sword, or the rope. His presence struck fear into the hearts of criminals and citizens alike. Yet his existence was also shunned, his touch avoided, his name whispered in unease. To be an executioner was to live in paradox, a servant of justice, yet condemned by society to walk forever on its margins. Punishment in the medieval world was often harsh and public. Justice was meant not only to correct, but also to warn, to strike fear into the hearts of others who might think of committing crime. Executions were spectacles, staged in town squares, on gallows hills, or outside castle gates. Crowds gathered, sometimes numbering in the thousands, to watch. The executioner stood at the center of this grim theater, his every movement scrutinized, his performance shaping the mood of the crowd. A clean strike of the sword or axe brought relief and even admiration. A clumsy blow, by contrast, brought outrage, shame, and suffering for both the condemned and the man who delivered the blow. The executioner's tools varied depending on the crime and the customs of the land. The sword or axe was used for beheadings, requiring strength and precision. The gallows stood for hangings, its rope swinging in the wind. Burning at the stake, though less common, called for grim preparation of wood and pitch. The wheel, a cruel device of torture and death, demanded even more gruesome work. Each tool carried not only physical weight, but symbolic meaning. Justice enacted through pain, order upheld through fear. The executioner was both craftsman and ritual performer, expected to carry out his duties swiftly and without error. Despite the centrality of his role, the executioner lived a life of stigma. Many towns forced executioners to reside outside their walls, near the gallows or on the fringes of society. They were often forbidden from attending church with others, eating in public inns, or marrying freely. People feared that his touch carried bad luck or spiritual contamination. Children were warned not to play near his home. Yet paradoxically, when the time came for judgment, it was this shunned figure that everyone depended on. The law could declare a sentence, but without the executioner, justice could not be carried out. Some executioners inherited their role. In certain families, the position passed from father to son, the stigma along with the duty. Others were criminals themselves, offered the chance to escape punishment if they took up the grim trade. For some, it was a livelihood chosen because few other options remained. Payment could be modest, but often it included not only wages, but also certain privileges. The right to collect goods from the condemned, exemption from some taxes, or the ability to run side businesses, such as tanning hides or disposing of carcasses. These additional roles tied the executioner further to tasks associated with death and impurity. The contradictions of the profession were immense. The executioner was feared, avoided, even hated, yet people demanded that he perform his duty with skill and fairness. They relied on him to uphold order, yet despised him for the very work he did. He embodied the uncomfortable truth that justice, in its harshest form, required blood on human hands. Few wanted to look too closely at those hands, yet they could not ignore them. Imagine a day in the life of an executioner. In the early morning, he sharpens his sword, the scrape of stone against metal echoing in his small house at the edge of town. He is summoned to the square, where a scaffold has been built. The crowd gathers, murmuring, waiting. The condemned is brought forth, pale and trembling. The executioner leads him to the block, positions him carefully, and raises the blade. For a moment, the world is silent. Then, with a single stroke, it is done. The crowd gasps, some crossing themselves, others cheering. The executioner wipes his blade, his face unreadable. He has done his duty, yet he will not be invited to share bread with those who applauded his skill. In folklore and imagination, executioners became figures of dread. Tales painted them as heartless brutes, or as cursed men doomed to wander with blood on their hands. Some were believed to practice dark arts, their intimacy with death granting them strange powers. In reality, many were ordinary men caught in extraordinary circumstances, balancing their humanity against the weight of their work. Some sought to comfort the condemned, offering words of peace before the end. Others distanced themselves, treating their duty as mechanical necessity. Each lived with the burden in his own way. Over time, executioners became more professionalized, especially in larger cities. Their skill was valued, their presence formalized by law. Yet the stigma never fully faded. They remained figures apart, necessary yet unwelcome. Their story reminds us of the contradictions at the heart of justice, that society demands order, but recoils from the means by which it is enforced. As you let this story rest in your mind, picture the quiet figure of an executioner walking home at dusk, his sword wrapped and hidden, his steps heavy. The town he served closes its doors to him. Children look away, and yet tomorrow, if another sentence is passed, he will be called again. Strange though his job was, It was one of the most enduring in the Middle Ages, a reminder that even in times of faith and pageantry, the harsh shadow of justice was never far away. Among the many professions of the Middle Ages, few carried the air of elegance, mystery, and prestige quite like the falconer. While the rat-catcher and the gong farmer labored in filth, and the executioner carried out grim duties, the falconer's work was bound to the world of nobility, luxury, and spectacle. His task was to train and manage birds of prey, falcons, hawks, and other raptors, used in the noble art of falconry. This strange and specialized profession reveals the fascination medieval society had with nature, status, and the delicate bond between human and animal. Falconry, the practice of hunting with trained birds, was considered one of the most refined pursuits of the aristocracy. It combined sport, status, and symbolism. A nobleman seen with a falcon on his arm displayed not only wealth, but also mastery over the natural world. The birds themselves were prized possessions, sometimes more valuable than horses or jewels. Kings and queens gave them as diplomatic gifts, exchanged them as signs of favor, and paraded them at feasts and tournaments. To care for such creatures required expertise, and thus the falconer emerged, a servant of high standing, entrusted with creatures that embodied power and prestige. The falconer's work began long before the hunt. Training a bird of prey required patience, skill, and a deep understanding of animal behavior. A young falcon, once captured or bred in captivity, had to be carefully accustomed to human presence. The falconer spent days and weeks with the bird perched on his arm, feeding it, speaking softly, and gradually introducing it to the rhythm of life among people. Step by step, the falcon learned to fly from the falconer's arm, to return at a call, and to chase game when commanded. This bond of trust was delicate, for the bird remained wild at heart. A falcon poorly trained could vanish into the sky, never to return. The tools of the trade were many and distinctive. Leather hoods were used to keep the birds calm, covering their sharp eyes until the moment of the hunt. Jesses, small leather straps, attached to their legs, allowed the falconer to control them. Bells tied to their feet jingled as they flew, helping the falconer track them through the sky. A lure, often a piece of meat or feathers tied to a string, was swung in circles to recall the bird. These items, crafted with care, reflected the precision required to maintain the bond between falconer and falcon. Without them, the art of falconry could not function. The hunts themselves were grand events, blending sport and ceremony. Nobles mounted their horses, their falcons perched proudly on their arms. The falconer walked beside them, guiding the birds, releasing them at the right moment. With astonishing speed, the falcon soared into the sky, circling high before diving like an arrow toward its prey, a rabbit, a pheasant, or even larger game. The crowd watched in awe as the bird struck, its talons flashing, its wings beating powerfully. Once the catch was made, the falconer hurried to retrieve the bird, calming it, feeding it, and preparing it for the next flight. Every successful hunt was both a spectacle and a statement, proof of the noble's refinement, wealth, and dominion. Life as a falconer was privileged in some ways, yet demanding in others. Falconers often lived close to their noble masters, enjoying access to castles and courts that other servants never knew. They were respected for their rare skills, sometimes earning high wages or even land in reward. Yet their days were filled with labor, feeding, cleaning, training, and constant vigilance. Birds of prey required daily care, and a falconer who failed in his duty could face disgrace or punishment. The stakes were high, for the birds were treasures of immense value, and their well-being reflected directly upon their masters. The role also carried symbolic meaning. Falcons were associated with nobility, courage, and honor. Different birds reflected different ranks. For example, in some traditions, only kings could fly the most prized species, while lesser nobles used others. The falconer, as the custodian of these birds, stood at the heart of this symbolism. He was both servant and specialist, invisible in his labor, yet essential to the grandeur of the hunt. In his hands rested not only the birds themselves, but also the image of his master, his prestige. Imagine the daily rhythm of a falconer's life. At dawn, he enters the mews, the enclosure where the birds are kept. The air smells of straw and feathers. He checks each bird, adjusting hoods, cleaning jesses, offering fresh meat. He lifts one to his arm, feeling its weight, watching the sharp eyes flash as the hood is removed. Later, he walks into the fields with his master, the falcon perched calmly as the hunt begins. The moment of release comes, the bird soaring into the sky, a blur of motion that captures every eye. When it returns, the falconer whispers softly, rewarding it with food, his heart steady with relief that the bond has held. Falconers were often men, but records suggest that women, too, practiced the art, especially among the nobility. Queens and noblewomen were depicted with falcons on their arms, their elegance heightened by the presence of the bird. Falconry transcended gender, uniting men and women of rank in a shared passion. Yet beneath the glamour, it was the falconer, skilled, patient, and devoted, who ensured that the practice thrived. The strange beauty of the falconer's profession lies in its blend of nature and culture, wildness and control. It reminds us that the Middle Ages were not only about war, faith, and survival, but also about the pursuit of beauty, mastery, and refinement. The falcon soaring high and returning to the hand embodied the delicate balance of freedom and discipline that medieval nobles admired. The falconer, standing quietly beside, was the hidden craftsman of that balance. As you rest with this story, picture the stillness of dawn on a medieval estate. A nobleman stands with a falcon on his arm, the bird hooded and calm. Beside him, the falconer waits, steady and patient, his tools ready. With a nod, the hood is lifted, and the bird takes flight, rising into the endless sky. Strange though his profession may seem today, the falconer was a vital figure of the medieval world, a master of both patience and precision, whose quiet labor gave wings to the grandeur of the age. Among the many strange professions of the Middle Ages, few are as haunting and theatrical as that of the professional mourner. In an age when death was ever present, in plague, in war, in famine, mourning was not just a private sorrow, but a public ritual. Families wanted their grief to be seen, heard, and remembered, and to achieve this, they sometimes hired others to weep, wail, and lament on their behalf. These mourners, whose tears were paid for in coin or goods, turned grief into performance, embodying the sorrow of others and giving voice to loss in a way that was both deeply human and strangely staged. The practice of hiring mourners was not unique to Europe, nor was it confined to the Middle Ages. It has roots in the ancient world, appearing in cultures from Egypt to Rome, and echoes of it survive even today in some traditions. But in the medieval world, professional mourners played a distinctive role. They were called to funerals and burials, to stand at the edges of graves or processions, raising their voices in lamentation. Their cries pierced the air, drawing attention to the weight of the family's grief, ensuring that no death passed unnoticed. In a society where honor, reputation, and the memory of one's lineage mattered deeply, such displays of mourning became part of the social fabric. Imagine a funeral in a medieval village. The church bell tolls slowly, its sound rolling across the fields. Villagers gather, solemn and silent, as the body is carried toward the graveyard. At the front or along the sides, professional mourners wail loudly, their voices rising and falling in practiced sorrow. They beat their breasts, tear at their hair, and cry out the name of the departed. Their grief is dramatic, unmistakable, impossible to ignore. For the watching crowd, the performance ensures that the family's loss is recognized, that the dead is honored with a chorus of sorrow larger than what the family alone might express. The role of professional mourners reveals the communal nature of medieval life. Mourning was not seen as something to be hidden or borne quietly. It was to be shared, displayed, and ritualized. The louder the lament, the greater the tribute. To hire mourners was to signal that the deceased was worth remembering, that the family's grief was deep and deserving of respect. In this sense, mourning became both an act of devotion and a statement of social standing. The cries of mourners echoed not only sorrow, but also status, proclaiming that this death mattered. For the mourners themselves, the work required skill and resilience. To weep convincingly on command was no simple task. Some drew upon real experiences of loss, letting personal grief fuel their performance. Others learned to produce tears with effort, to raise their voices in haunting tones that carried across crowds. They became specialists in lamentation, turning human sorrow into a practiced art. Yet the work could also be draining. To spend one's days surrounded by funerals, grief, and death was heavy labor for the spirit, and many mourners lived on the margins of society, their role both needed and avoided. Payment for mourning varied. In poorer villages, mourners might be rewarded with food, drink, or small coins. In wealthier households, they might receive more generous sums, or even clothing and gifts. Some towns had groups of women known for their skill in lamentation, called upon again and again to lend their voices to local funerals. In monasteries and churches, chanting monks sometimes filled a similar role, though their cries were prayers rather than wails. Yet the professional mourner stood apart, not cloaked in holy robes, but in raw, human expression, unbound by formality, their grief loud and untamed. There was, however, controversy around the practice. Some clergy condemned professional mourners as insincere, accusing them of turning sacred grief into spectacle. They argued that true mourning should come from the heart, not from the purse. Yet people continued to hire them, drawn to the comfort of a louder chorus of sorrow, to the reassurance that their dead would not be forgotten. In times when plague and war filled graveyards daily, professional mourners ensured that even in the crowd of death, one life could still be marked with distinction. The presence of mourners also carried psychological weight. For the grieving family, hearing their own sorrow echoed and amplified could bring a strange kind of relief. The mourners gave form to emotions too heavy to speak, allowing the bereaved to rest in silence while others voiced the pain. Their wails turned private grief into a shared performance, a reminder that loss was not endured alone. In this sense, the profession was both theatrical and profoundly human, balancing artifice and authenticity in ways that still resonate today. Imagine the daily life of a mourner. At dawn, she is called to a home where death has visited. She dresses in dark, rough clothing, her hair loose, her voice prepared. She joins the procession, walking with measured steps, her cries rising as the coffin is carried past the villagers. At the graveside, she kneels, clutching the earth, wailing the name of the departed as the family weeps beside her. Her performance draws tears from the crowd, her voice echoing long after the last clods of earth fall upon the coffin. When the ritual ends, she returns home, weary but ready for the next call. Her own life is simple, but her profession demands that she embody the grief of many, carrying their sorrow on her voice day after day. The paradox of the professional mourner lies in the question of sincerity. Were her tears real, or were they an act? Did it matter? For those who hired her, the effect was what mattered most. The performance gave dignity to death, honored the family, and satisfied the community's sense of ritual. In this way, the mourner's sincerity was less important than her presence, her ability to fill silence with lament, to make visible the weight of loss. As you let this story rest in your thoughts, picture the quiet of a medieval graveyard at dusk. The candles flicker, the crowd has dispersed, and only the echo of wailing lingers on the wind. Somewhere, a mourner walks home, her voice hoarse, her heart perhaps heavy, perhaps empty. She has given her tears to another's grief, her cries to another's loss. Strange though her profession was, it reflects a timeless truth, that sorrow longs to be shared, and that even in death, the human need for recognition, ritual, and remembrance is as strong as life itself. And so we come to the end of our journey through the strange and fascinating professions of the Middle Ages. The rat catchers who hunted vermin in the shadows, to the gong farmers who braved the filth of cesspits, to the sin-eaters who carried the weight of souls. Each role has revealed a world both alien and familiar. We have walked with leech collectors in their marshes, heard the cries of town criers in busy squares, and stood beside plague doctors in their eerie masks. We have seen the elegance of falconers, the sharp wit of jesters, and the sorrowful voices of professional mourners. Together, these figures remind us that history is not only the story of kings and battles, but also of ordinary people doing extraordinary, unusual, and sometimes unsettling work to keep their societies alive. The strangeness of these jobs makes them unforgettable, but it is their humanity that lingers. Each profession, however odd, was born from need, the need to eat, to heal, to protect, to mourn, to laugh, to survive. These were people like us, living in a world very different, yet shaped by the same desires for safety, dignity, and meaning. Their stories, though centuries old, still echo in our imagination, carrying lessons about resilience, creativity, and the many ways humans adapt to the challenges of their time. As we close, I invite you to let your mind drift, allowing these stories to settle like quiet embers in the dark. Perhaps you find comfort in the rhythm of history, in knowing that even the strangest roles played their part in the long march of human life. And perhaps, as you rest, you can carry with you the thought that history is not only about the grand and noble, but also about the curious, the overlooked, and the forgotten. Before you go, I'd like to thank you for joining me tonight. If you enjoyed this journey through the strange jobs of the Middle Ages, please take a moment to subscribe to the channel. It helps us bring you more stories like this, told slowly and gently, perfect for drifting into sleep. I'd also love to hear from you. Leave a comment about what kinds of history you are most interested in, or when you like to listen. Some of you may put these stories on before bed, others while working or relaxing, and hearing your experiences helps guide what we share next. For now, let the echoes of these strange professions fade into the quiet of the night. Rest well, and remember that history, in all its oddness and wonder, will always be here to keep you company.